So, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the inaugural meeting of the Berlin Energy Forum. My name is Ben Aris. I'm the editor-in-chief and founder of BNE IntelliNews. We're a news organization been covering emerging markets, starting off in emerging Europe and Eurasia, but we now cover global emerging markets. And in addition, we also produce Newsbase, which is an energy publication, again, publishing every day, covering global energy, oil, gas, and power. The idea of the forum was to get people together and bring in experts from the region and do deep dives into the ins and outs of energy questions, particularly as those as relate to Europe. I'd also like to introduce Tom O'Donnell, who's going to be my co-moderator, who's a professor of nuclear science and also consultant to various governments, German, Polish, on energy issues in the region. So starting on my left, this is Chris Wiefer. He's the founder and CEO of Macro Advisors, or Advisory.
Yes, Advisory.
Who's also, I know from Moscow days, has been knocking around for 45 years doing emerging markets, starting off in the Middle East. And in Moscow, he was head of research at pretty much every investment bank on both the Russian side and the international side, an absolute dyed-in-the-wool expert. Next to him is Christoph Ruhl, and I do it every time, don't I? Yeah, and I never remember. He was chief economist at the, I've got 50-50 chance here, World Bank? Yes. Yeah, in Moscow, and then went on to be chief economist at BP, and he's now a fellow at, sorry, I don't remember this, in the Black Forest? Columbia, there you go. Also dyed-in-the-wool expert on oil, gas, energy. We talk regularly about what's been going on for years. Then we have Benjamin Hildenstock. Yeah? Got that right. He's a senior economist at the Kiev School of Economics. Before that at International Institute for Finance in Washington. And he's leading a team. The KSC, if you don't know it, is an outstanding institution based in Kiev that's been studying the whole impact of energy and sanctions, and they do excellent work. You should sign up to their newsletter, monthly newsletter that digs into oil price, shadow fleet, how sanctions are working, the effect on the Russian economy. It's required reading, and the presentation I'm about to give, I stole half the slides from KSC. So then let's dive in. What I'd like to do is set the scene. The point of sanctions is to starve the Kremlin of funds so that it can't pay for its war in Ukraine. So how is that going? Can I have the slide, please? Looking at the current account, Russian current account, this is the profit and loss of Russia, Inc. And you can see pre-war, and then we see the 2002 energy crisis where energy prices spiked. Russia earned an extraordinary $235 billion excess current account surplus. Whereas pre-war, in 2001, when we had the bump from the end of COVID, there was a very strong bounce back that sent commodity prices up. It earned a record $120 billion. And I'm saying these numbers so you can see the difference, because in 2023, the surplus fell to $51 billion. So did sanctions work? Certainly got hit in 2023 after the oil and gas, the twin oil sanctions came into effect. Slide, please. But you can see from this is oil export earnings in dollars and the same in rubles, the one that counts as far as the budget's concerned. And you can see pre-war, post-war, not much difference. Basically, the government, the Kremlin, is earning as much money as it did before the war now, in so much as the sanctions have not starved the Russian government of cash. Next slide, please. To make the point, this is every March, this is from IIF, every March for the last 15 years, the current account surplus in that month. And again, energy crisis, huge spike. This March, the current account surplus doubled from 5 billion to 13 billion, which is the second highest in the last 15 years. And that's a function, although the volumes are being reduced, because the prices of oil have increased, thanks to OPEC and various other factors, that's more than compensating for the effectiveness or little effect, some effect that the sanctions are having. And the bottom line is Russia Inc. is still in profit. Slide. So let's look at this in detail in the Russian budget. This is all the last 5 years. I've broken it down. Slide, please. So just looking at 2020 and 2021, 2020 was the COVID year, so you can see that the running deficits, Russia doesn't do that normally, but this was money spent to help the economy during COVID. And then 2021, you can see it bounce back, and as I said, there was a strong recovery, strong growth. The military spending pre-war was about $60 million a year. The deficit in 2021, the economy was flat again after that heavy spending the year before, and GDP bounced back by 5.5%. Slide. Bring in 2022, the start of the war. And here things started to change. Military spending went up to 75 in the first year, but the economy was walloped by the shock of the extreme sanctions which came in March. And again, things are fairly normal, but the shock of the economy was offset by the massive spike in energy prices. So again, you can see, although we had some nasty months, on the whole, the budget was fairly healthy. And it was this period here where we had the opportunity to actually crash the Russian economy. And the mistake that was made was that we continued to pay our gas and oil bills. So at the same time as sanctioning Russia, we were sending billions and billions of dollars to pay gas and oil, which offset the effect of the sanctions. And Nabulina, the governor of the central bank, she acted with extraordinary decision. She put in 1,000 basis point rate hike. She introduced, without blinking an eyelid, really stringent capital controls, banned the export of money, mandatory surrender requirements for every Russian company that was earning forex, so that was bolstering it. And the economy stabilized incredibly rapidly as a result of this. And so if we'd done something like take that oil and gas money and put it into escrow, then the Russian economy would have collapsed. It was a missed opportunity. Slide, please. Oh, sorry, before you go on. Also notice here, January, very light spending month normally. December, 1/5 of the revenues are spent in December. And this one is significant because at the end of 2022, on 5th of December, we introduced the sanctions on crude. And so although the budget was in profit cumulatively until November, it suddenly crashed out in a spectacular way, twice as much as normal. Slide, please. So 2023, again, off to a horrible start, biggest deficit in January on record. Oil and gas revenues plummeted by 49% as the oil product sanctions came in February. However, this is slightly deceptive, in so much as at this point, everybody was saying that the deficit was going to blow out to 3%, 4%. Some people were even saying 12%. In other words, the sanctions were working, collapsing oil and gas revenues. But Silyanov, the finance minister, said, no, we're still on track for 2% deficit this year because we're front-loading a lot of the spending because we don't want to have that surprise at the end of the year. And if you see at the end of the year, you can see that the spending was cut in half. So that worked. At the same time, the tax system had to be remade, and as the sanctions came in, the product sanctions, this was the point where all the ships stopped going from Primorsk down to Rotterdam and were sent all the way around the world to Gujarat and the teapot refineries in China. That journey takes 4 months there and back. And so once that has completed that circle, the revenues start again. And sure enough, you can see here in the summer, 4 months later, they're back in profit. And what it says is that Russia very successfully, and to everyone's surprise, completely remade their energy export machine so that they redirected what was a short trip to Rotterdam is now going to Asia and back. And once that circle is closed, because they have enough ships in the shadow fleet, the revenues go back to normal. And you see in the second half of the year, they're actually back in profit. And again, military spending's up. The deficit was supposed to be 3 to 4 to 12% at the beginning, ended up being exactly where Silyanov said it would be, 2% of GDP. Slide. So year to date, oh, that's wrong. Sorry, I made a mistake. It should be, yeah?
Maybe you stand on the other side.
Ah. Yeah?
Okay.
Yeah.
Because for camera it's better from this side. Online.
Anyway, sorry, there's been a screw up here. The military spending now up to 140 billion. That's twice what it was at the start of the war. And yet, if you look at the budget, it's still coping very well. And again, the early months, this looks like it's bad, but Silyanov has said that he's doing the same thing as last year. He's front-loading it, but now he's spreading it over the first 3 months. And these months were a lot of spending, so at the end of the year, the deficit's going to be much less. And he's predicting only 0.8% deficit this year, as opposed to 2% last year. And moreover, the forecast for 2025 is the budget will be flat. So they've doubled military spending to a third of what America is spending on its military now. And they're predicting by next year they'll have a balanced budget, which is pretty stunning. It means lots of money is coming in. And this 1.5 trillion rubles, by the way, rule of thumb, if you divide that by 100, you get to billions of euros. So 14 billion euros. But this is only 0.8% of deficit of GDP. And they're expecting the oil revenue to increase. The EU just increased its forecast for oil this year to $85 average, which means they'll end the year with a very slight deficit. Next slide, please. So these are the details. I won't spend a lot of time on this, but you can notice that the revenues are up by 50% in the first 3 months, first 4 months, whereas expenditure is only up by 20%, and the deficit remains very small. Notice, interestingly, too, that the oil and gas revenues, they're up by a whopping 80% in the last 2 months. But then so is the non-oil and gas, which is up by 40%. And this part is much bigger than the oil and gas revenues. This is taxable stuff inside Russia that you can't sanction. And of that, VAT is by far the biggest bit. And it's because the incomes are going up faster than inflation, you've got a bit of a consumption boom going on. And so you can actually finance the military spending simply from the domestic taxes without relying on oil and gas. But of course, oil and gas drives the whole economy. Next slide, please. But there is stress in the system. The sanctions do have an effect. And this is the one place where you can actually see it happening is the discount on that the Russians have to offer. So pre-war, it was only $2 discount euros to Brent. And now it fell to nearly 10%, but now it's rising again. So Russians are having to offer bigger discounts in order to sell. But again, this is Urals blend, the one that goes through Europe. If you look at the ESLP blend, which is the one that goes pipeline to China, and all the Asian business and the other blends, there's no impact on the discount at all. That stuff is flowing unfettered. And the volumes of the Ural stuff is actually being massively reduced because of the European sanctions. Slide, please. Again, inflation's a problem, it's high, but you can see here the emergency hike that Nabulina put in and how quickly it stabilized. She took it off again, but now long term they've got a structural problem with high inflation, which is going to slow things down. So they're trying to deal with that. It's a pain in the neck, but all of us lived in Russia at a time inflation was double digits. First time it went into single digits was only in 2007. So it's slowing, it's a problem, but it's not a huge problem. Slide. Unemployment, this is due to the war, but it's ironically also driving up nominal wages faster than it's driving up than inflation, and so everyone's real wages are up by about 6%. We haven't seen that for a decade, since the beginning of, since 2014. So people are feeling flush. The people on the street are actually feeling well off for once. Slide. Wages are growing twice as fast as prices. So for the man in the street, the Russians, they're actually kind of happy with this war, although they're aware inflation is high. Slide. The PMI, this represents manufacturing index. Anything above 50 is expansion. Services and manufacturing is booming. These are the strongest PMI numbers in Europe. Next slide. External debt has fallen, and again, reserves 600, that's including the frozen money, but the total external debt is about 326, which means that Russia could pay off its entire external debt tomorrow in cash. They have that much still in reserves. And this makes it almost impossible to sanction Russia, because the way you sanction countries are the ones you cut them off from debt, and then they can't refinance, and they collapse. And Russia's put itself in a position where it basically has no debt. That makes it incredibly difficult to effectively sanction. Slide. So they're turning to the domestic bond market. But again, that's like $20 billion, and there's a pool of at least 17 trillion rubles in the Russian banking system. So there's still plenty of leeway to finance it from domestic debt. Slide. So that's all I wanted to say. Thank you. Can you bring the next presentation up? So I'd like to hand over to Benjamin, who's going to do the other side of the coin.
Thank you very much for your interest in this topic. You can go to the first slide, please. So basically, I'm picking up where the other Ben left off, which is export earnings and budget revenues in Russia from oil. So you see here the three markers: the start of the full-scale invasion, the start of the EU crude oil embargo and price cap, and the start of the EU products embargo and price cap. Left-hand side, and in dark blue, is export earnings in billions dollars. Right-hand side, and in billions of rubles, is budget revenues from oil. And I agree with Ben that basically we are back where we were at the start of the full-scale invasion, but obviously in between there have been some developments that indicate that for a time the sanctions regime really had an impact. Next slide. So
Let's hit it again.
It's working.
it's working.
Yeah, it's working for the camera, not for the audience. That's very good.
Okay, great. So the important thing about the effectiveness of Western energy sanctions on Russia, oil sanctions in particular, is the price, because it is the declared objective of the sanctions coalition to keep the Russian oil in the market, to make sure that there is no trouble in the global oil market and there are no prices rising at the gas pump. So basically what the coalition decided to do is to create a system, the oil price cap, which is intended to keep the Russian oil flowing onto the market, and it has. Russian export volumes of crude and products have been extremely stable over the last 2 years. So that has been successful, if you want to call it that. But the mechanism through which then Russian export earnings and budget revenues were supposed to be reduced is via the price. And specifically the discount between Russian export prices, I'm plotting the discount of Urals here, versus global prices, so Brent. And you see, as Ben mentioned before in the bars, that before the start of the full-scale invasion, the discounts was basically a couple of dollars. And then right after the start of the full-scale war, it went to $30, $35, which is the kind of dark blue period that you see here, at a time when global oil prices were also soaring because of political uncertainty. This really had nothing to do with sanctions. There were no meaningful sanctions on Russian oil at the time. The US, Canada, Australia, some of those placed embargoes on all Russian energy and fossil fuels, but they weren't importing any of it to begin with. There were no European sanctions on Russian oil at the time. So this is basically just a risk premium that people were paying because of the war. Russian oil was kind of tainted, so to speak. But as you can see then, in the couple of months, let's say in the summer and early fall of 2022, what happens is what usually happens, which is the players in the market adapt to this new situation and they figure out what they can get away with. And they figure out that Russian oil is actually still somewhat tainted, but not quite as tainted. So the discount falls to something like $20. Then comes in December of 2022, the EU embargo on crude oil and the corresponding price cap, which was set at $60 per barrel. And you see that the discount rises quite dramatically to over $40 per barrel at a time. No. And this costs Russia quite a lot of money, right? So $10 in difference in oil prices is roughly $20 billion in export earnings over a full year. So $40 discount is $80 billion in export earnings that are lost. Now, I know this didn't happen over the entire period of time, but it's the kind of magnitude of change that can be achieved. Now, the question of faith here is now, was this the embargo or was this the price cap? And I really think it was the embargo. And there are two reasons for why I come to this conclusion. First of all, Ben already showed you earlier that the same did not happen in the ESPO market, right? And that's really indicative of the embargo being the driver here. Because in the market for Urals, so seaborne exports from ports in the Baltic Sea and Black Sea, the market changed considerably. The biggest buyer, almost only buyer, European countries, was suddenly gone. Russia had to find new buyers. It found one, India, and a little bit more to China. But in order to accomplish that, it had to offer steep discounts, also because, as Ben pointed out earlier, the journey time is significantly longer, and hence transportation costs are longer. The market situation in the ESPO market did not change at all. There were no European buyers there. There were no buyers that could disappear. China was buying before. China was buying thereafter. Nothing really happened to the prices. That's the one point. The second one is, if you have a price cap, which is, let me remind you, a restriction on G7 and EU maritime service providers that can only participate in the export of Russian oil if it is sold at or below a certain price. If you have a market operating under two very different regimes, you would think in the price distribution, you would see like different humps, but we've actually never seen that. You know, you would expect a certain concentration of exports in volume terms around the market price and then around the $60 or slightly below, but we've never seen that. Which brings me and has brought others to the conclusion that it was really the EU embargo that drove this rather than the price cap. So then what happens over the course of basically the first, spring, summer, early fall of 2023 is that Russia adapts, and also Russia builds up its shadow fleet of tankers that I'll talk about in a second. Ben pointed out earlier that the discount has risen in recent months a little bit, as you can see there at the end. That's largely because of OFAC's designation of Russian shadow fleet vessels, which has simply created an additional risk premium in the market. Everyone involved in the shipment of Russian oil faces a higher risk of OFAC enforcement action, and gets compensated for that. But OFAC kind of stopped doing this in February, March, and hence the discount hasn't widened. Unfortunately, at the same time, as you see in the black line, the global oil price has risen quite considerably, including due to events in the Middle East, and that has basically more than offset the increase in the discount. Next slide, please. So now I want to talk about, briefly talk about two key problems with the energy sanctions regime and the price cap. The first one is enforcement, and so here we're talking about price cap violations specifically. So what I'm showing you here is the distribution of Russian seaborne crude oil exports in the last quarter of 2023. Roughly 30% of them still went out on vessels that have a service connection to the G7. In most cases, this is spill insurance from so-called P&I clubs. And a little bit more than 70% at the time were exported with the shadow fleet. Now, if you look at the price distribution now, you would expect to see something similar. Next slide, please. But you don't. So over this period of time, exactly 1.9% of Russian seaborne crude oil exports were sold below the $60 per barrel price cap threshold, and 98.1% were not. Which indicates, although the data sets are a little bit difficult to reconcile, but it indicates that there is essentially no price cap compliance. And what is happening is something we call attestation fraud, which basically means that an oil trader or broker, basically the entity that owns the oil at the time that the documentation has to be provided under the price cap regime, is lying about the prices. And this doesn't come as a terrible surprise if you look at who these entities are. So who is buying Russian oil after the start of the full-scale invasion, after the start of the EU embargo and the price cap? Well, it's no longer global energy traders, but it is either subsidiaries of Russian oil companies, so Litasco and so forth, or it is traders in places like Dubai that have just recently popped up and are suspected to be linked to Russian oil majors. So those entities we rely upon for the pricing information for assessment of the price cap and enforcement of the price cap. So this is problem number one. It's actually not new. We've seen this in the ESPO market since the start of the price cap regime, because there, as we've shown you, or as Ben showed you, the price was significantly above 60, so it made sense to falsify pricing information. Once Urals rose above the price cap in mid-2023, the problem just spilled into the broader market. Next slide, please. But there's a more fundamental problem with the price cap regime, and it's not violations, it's evasion, right? So Russia has built up this infamous shadow fleet, basically ships that have no service connection to the G7 and EU, and hence they do not fall under the price cap regime. So you can sell your oil for whatever you want here. And you see here the volume share for crude oil and products separately of Russian seaborne exports transported on shadow fleet vessels. And you see that for crude oil, we're up to 83% now, which means that the leverage of the price cap regime is very quickly going away if we don't do anything about it. It's a bit less extreme for oil products. The reason is simply, in our opinion, that the oil products price caps are so high that there's no need to evade them. So basically, the incentive has been to focus on crude oil and build up this fleet of vessels that, which should be said and emphasized, are largely at the end of their lifespan. They're old, they're underinsured or not insured at all, and they're basically running through EU territorial waters on a daily basis. Next slide. So this is actually the last slide, and I don't want to be entirely negative about this, and I hope that we can get into this during the conversation and the Q&A. Ineffective energy sanctions are not a foregone conclusion. There's actually a lot that we can do to address the issue of attestation fraud, to address the issue of the shadow fleet. And then there are other issues such as loopholes in the system. There's some exemptions. There's still Russian oil flowing through the Druzhba pipeline to the Czech Republic, Slovak Republic, and Austria. There's still a lot of Russian gas flowing to Europe via Ukraine, which is soon going to stop. And through Turkstream, there's Russian LNG coming to Europe still. There's Russian LNG transshipped through Europe, which hopefully will be addressed in the next EU sanctions package. There's still more to do, and we actually know what has to be done. Now it's a question of political will to actually do it. So let me leave it at that.
Thank you. I've got a lot of questions, but let's keep going. Chris, please.
Okay.
You're going to be an optimist, right?
Sorry?
You're going to be the optimist.
Well, they say that in Russia you get up in the morning being an optimist, you go to bed being a pessimist, and the next day you do the opposite. And so it is that there are, obviously the intensity of what we've all been living through for the last couple of years everywhere means that you are constantly looking at information, data points, trends, where you say, oh, look, that looks optimistic, and then the next day you see something else and you're entirely pessimistic. So there's a lot of flip-flop, and you can't really say one or the other. But I don't have a presentation, but so I'm just going to comment, obviously, on what we've heard. And so a couple of comments more to fill in the backdrop, I guess, to create a little bit of context. The first thing is that the Russians got serious about diversification, I suppose, efforts after sanctions first started after Crimea. So there was the East Siberian pipeline was built as a result of that. China was not a direct buyer of Russian oil in 2013, but of course was the biggest single buyer in 2022. There was a lot of, we now know, there was a lot of pre-planning on tanker acquisition. So it wasn't that they went out and in late 2022 and just suddenly found several hundred spare tankers. We know that there was a lot of work done to identify where tankers could be acquired and quickly, and all of that was put in place, which is why the Ghost Fleet was put in place so quickly. And obviously the numbers you show, it's very difficult to look at numbers on a comparative basis because, of course, we know that by the time, for example, the price cap was put in place, the crude price cap on December the 5th, 2022, you literally couldn't get another bucket of Urals oil into any Rotterdam storage depot because they were buying so much in advance of that, which explains why there was such a spike in 2022. And it also explains why there was such a dip in the first half of 23 because they were full. They had pre-bought in anticipation of the transition period. But so a lot of that. And the second thing, another point I wanted to make is that the role of Saudi Arabia is really important here. because Saudi Arabia, being the main driver, but the Emirates are the same, and I do spend a lot of time with the OPEC people in Vienna, and for quite some time, they have, talked about recognizing that there may be 10 years left in oil pricing market, maybe a dozen years, but not much more than that. People understand that it's coming to an end at some point. And therefore, they have a window, i.e. the OPEC producers have a window to earn as much money as they can to invest in kind of new technologies, new economies, etc. So bottom line is, I've heard from more than a few senior officials on more than one occasion, is that they're trying to target $100 Brent average for kind of the last 10 years. And so what we've seen, therefore, over the last 6 months of this year is Saudi willing to cut 1 million barrels of oil. The other OPEC countries willing to cut oil in order to prop the market, which is why we have a high price right now. If Saudi Arabia did not cut any oil, the price of Brent would be $50. It would certainly be below the price cap. I don't know, who knows what it would be. It would be a lot lower than it is today. So there's a very important meeting coming up on the 1st of July, where the OPEC Plus ministers will again review their strategy, will review production strategy, etc. And that's really important, because clearly if OPEC is producing more oil, then the discount on Russian crude is going to widen. Whereas if they stick with their limitation, or even if they cut more, then the price will go up and the discount will shrink. So don't forget that they're not a disinterested kind of bystander. They're very key in what's happening. So again, we've had the financial graphs that we've seen from Ben, and again we look at those in great detail. We talk to people in the finance ministry, and you're right, that is their narrative now, which is that they feel that they have kind of reached a level where the volume of oil is stable, the export mechanisms are stable, and the pricing mechanism also, they believe, is stable. There is a huge kind of threat has emerged, though, and it's not strictly oil related, but it nevertheless it potentially could be very damaging if it's not addressed. And this is the sanction which the US Treasury Department put in place last December. And what it said was that any international bank that's involved in any transaction with either a sanctioned individual, a sanctioned agency, or on a sanctioned transaction, whether it's technology, but it also covers paying for oil that's sold above the oil price cap. And what this US Treasury have said is that any international bank anywhere involved in those transactions run the risk of secondary sanctions from the US. So we have seen since the beginning of this year then a great deal of difficulty in Russia carrying out financial transactions, either paying for goods, which even with Chinese banks where the political relationship is clearly good, but Chinese banks don't want to take the risk. Emirates banks, there's been a huge problem constantly reported with Turkish banks, where they have simply stopped transacting with Russian counterparties because they don't want to take the risk of secondary sanctions. So it's now at the highest level. I certainly believe, and what I've heard is that one of the reasons why Putin went to Beijing so quickly after inauguration, clearly there's geopolitical reasons, wanting to show, best friends and all that sort of stuff, but also this topic of how to resolve how to prevent this kind of financial transaction problem becoming more critical, how to resolve it, how to get it back on track, was one of the key topics. It was never Power of Siberia 2 or more gas that did come up, but the key discussion was about unblocking or making sure that financial channels did not get blocked to the point where they would cause a crisis in Russia. And the same discussion is taking place with Erdogan and with the Emiratis and with the Indians to some extent. So watch that one. It's, as you say, there are things can be done. And that's, obviously blocking ships from using the Straits of Denmark because of environmental issues, etc. But if you can't get paid for your oil, it doesn't matter what you're selling it for. So this is a huge issue, and it's now ongoing. And say if the Russians needed to be resolved. My estimate is they need it resolved at the latest by September before you start to see a crisis. But it's at the highest political level. Maybe we assume it will get resolved, but nevertheless it is something to watch. And then I guess later, maybe not now, we can go on to gas. But because I always say about Russia, or have regularly said about Russia, a country that generally does the right thing when there's absolutely no other choice, or where the consequence of not doing it. It was paraphrasing. Yes, I will not. I will not claim exclusivity, but paraphrasing. But you can see it, and you see it time. I don't know if any Russians here, but from my experience over the last 26 years living in Moscow, and for the last several years still in and out, is you could tell a Russian, do not touch that because you'll burn your fingers. They got to burn their fingers, and then they won't do it again. And it's the same with government policy. It's about the economic policies and planning and budget issues. Absolutely, there have been very sensible voices, Alexei Kudrin, a well-known finance minister for a long time, and plenty of others that have been constantly preaching and promoting different strategies which are very sensible and got zero support from the Kremlin or for the people with real power until they became a crisis, and then suddenly they have to be fixed. And you get an enormous amount of kind of political and administrative support in fixing the problem. So, like the ghost tankers, or now we see it with gas, and we will see it with gas over the next year. There'll be a lot more gas going to different places, which should have been done 10 years ago or a long time ago, and it's been talked about for a long, long time, but, it's now an issue. So bottom line is, the critical question I ask time and time again, does sanctions work? Clearly that's a question that cannot be answered with a simple yes or no. It is a no and a yes. So no, in that they have not worked to the extent that those who were originally designed and called for sanctions had hoped for, which is a quick financial crisis and a collapse of the state. That clearly is a no, and we can see the numbers. But we are definitely at the maybe stage. It's far to say as yet, but the maybe stage as in, we see the budget shift towards military-industrial complex at the expense of other projects that had been planned, which were aimed at diversifying the economy, making Russia a more advanced economy, all of which have been delayed, at least sidelined because the money's had to go elsewhere. That clearly will have an impact on the economy. You mentioned about the low unemployment, 2.9%. That's a huge demographic issue that Russia has been aware of, has been for 20 years is coming. The money, there was to be a significant amount of money used to address that in Putin's current term. This is part of national projects. That's now also all had to be diverted away to military-industrial complex. So that problem is going to get worse. So unemployment is low, but companies are having to pay a lot more to keep full employment. I talked to somebody recently who said that their average wage bill last year was 20%, and they expect to pay the same again this year. So yes, you can see therefore why people are happy and they're getting well paid and there's low unemployment and the shops are full and consumption is good. But all of which is at the expense of long-term or even medium-term economic planning. So that's where the maybe is. It's still too early to say no, but that's kind of right. Yeah, of course. I was about to finish anyway.
Oh, right.
Yes. Good.
So on the, I was supposed to say something about the impact of all these events on the European perception. But let me say something straight to the sanctions, because I differ a little bit with what has been said here. If one wants to look at the energy sanctions and whether they work or not, one can actually come to a very clear conclusion. And in order to get there, it's probably useful to step back a little bit. There's a well-defined way of having what is called economic warfare, by which, techniques by which you disturb other people's trade, their financial systems, their main exports, and so on. And economic warfare was something which was prepared by both sides before 2022. By Russia, with this Fortress Russia, where they try to hide their financial reserves, make the country resilient, and by the G7. And it's a very, very unique situation when you think about it. We have on the one side, you have the G7 producing more than 50% of global GDP. And on the other side, you have the biggest commodity exporter on the planet, exporting just in the case of oil about 13%. the key to understand about the energy sanctions, and they kicked, and also I should say historically, when you go back, what happened after 22, after the invasion, was first were financial sectors employed with a radicality which surprised most of us, with confiscating all the central bank assets of Russia. The energy sanctions kicked in relatively late, and they only kicked in response to Russia gradually sort of obstructing Russian gas deliveries into Europe. It was not the first choice of the G7. And of course, everyone knows why that is and where the real problem lies, which is that the G7 from the beginning was unwilling to cut itself off from Russian oil supplies and to engage with the perspective of higher oil prices. And you cannot have your cake and eat it too. As long as that is the case, energy sanctions will remain impotent. And that is still the case. It's kind of surprising when you think about it, because the oil price is not high. When you look at the oil price in inflation-adjusted terms, it is actually very, very moderate. It is way below phases like in the 2010s or in the high phase between 2011 and 13, when it was like in nominal terms already 111 on average, and now it's 80-something, and in real terms even higher. And where no crisis was caused. So it is not an exorbitant high, and when you adjust it for efficiency gains, it becomes even lower. But for a variety of reasons, the G7 was never willing to really engage in biting sanctions because on the commodity sector and the oil sector, because they were not willing to pay a higher oil price. And just as a little footnote, also this price cap thing, the more successful the price cap is, controlled by OPEC and others, the bigger the competitive advantage of India, China, and by now also Turkey becomes versus the US. That's a lesson that's not lost on the Chinese and the Indians, who are very, very keen on redirecting all this. It's just a simple economic mechanism, which would put a cap on that. So from that failure of really addressing the biggest export of Russia follows three conclusions. Number one, it's not hopeless to employ sanctions, but there's no quick collapse, no quick success, no quick cutting them out of oil. You have to go the long way through the financial sector, through cutting them off from international payment system and so on, and then confiscating something which nobody really wants to do, but confiscating reserves to create financial pressure. It takes time, is much less certain than the energy sectors, but that could be done. Personally, if somebody tells me we tighten energy sanctions, I think I don't believe it. I just don't see the point of it. The more important conclusions is, what does it mean for the actual situation in the war? People like me who have written about this, have observed this for the longest time, would have been worried now something goes wrong in the Middle East and something becomes there bloody and there's a disturbance in global oil supplies and that might cause geopolitical risks. By now it looks as if the Ukraine has discovered that it is relatively easy to attack by drones Russian refining infrastructure. I'm sure we will talk about this later. And that is extrapolated by many people, that it is equally easy to attack Russian infrastructure for oil exports, for gas exports. It's not quite true, because refining, the kit is complicated, mostly imported from the West and therefore subject to sanctions. Export terminals are slightly easier and technologically less advanced and therefore harder to disrupt, but it's potentially possible to disrupt it. So all of a sudden, this very strange situation emerges where you have now the US, the key player, facing its elections. President Biden, a dozen times on record, including from his administration, they really don't want higher oil prices. They really go cap in hand to Riyadh to beg for prices to stay where they are. And then Trump, who says he can end the war in whatever, how many days. The possibility emerges that Ukraine is doing something which was supposed to be used by the West as a medium against Russia, which is to cut effectively Russian oil supplies. And I think that is not the most likely outcome of the current situation, but that is a distinct possibility of that, and one should keep it in mind. I mean, if I would be Ukrainian and I would see the elections in the US threatening to go in the wrong direction, then what we always would have assumed is the Russian scenario, when they, with the back on the wall, militarily, they would disrupt oil markets to cause a big crisis, can become a Ukrainian scenario, or at least a way which can be used to exercise political pressure. I think that is one consequence of that situation one should be aware of. This is not just the destruction of refining and not bringing crude to the front. This is opening up the possibility of putting political pressure on the G7, which the G7 has failed itself to exercise through the Russian situation, through sanctions, effective energy sanctions on Russia. And the second immediate consequence is something Chris has hinted at. It's also clear who emerges as the clear winner of that situation, and that's the Middle East. That's the Middle East, who keeps its oil prices higher than they otherwise would have been, who benefits from the redirection of payment systems. When my friends talk about Dubai, I live in Abu Dhabi, then they always call it Casablanca, because of all the Russians looking for paper there. And I think that is something which is a strange twist when you think of a few years ago when the US was very dependent on the Middle East, and then after the shale revolution, when everybody thought the US now can do something without the Middle East, can free itself. So here we are back in a situation which gives probably the last hooray, but an enormous power to these oil producers who are relatively cheap, and throws us all back into a world where the future of oil markets will depend on things like peak oil demand and stuff which we have talked before, but maybe this current situation a bit prolonged through the war in the Ukraine.
Can I ask two specific questions? One is that OFAC introduced these smart sanctions in December. This decision with the banks was key and took 41 tankers out of circulation from the shadow fleet. So it's possible to do. However, they took those 41 out and stopped. Why was that? And the second question is the drone attacks. The Americans were against Zelensky flying these attacks on the oil refineries. But in the meantime, it's been pointed out that if you do damage and reduce the oil product production by estimated 14%, all that happens is that Russia increases the exports of crude, and so the effect on the international market has been negligible. And therefore, the drone attack policy has been working against all odds, and so that they should encourage Zelensky to carry on do that. Anyone want to take that?
The first one, I can pass to Drummond. On the first point, as you say, 41 tankers. About 2/3 of those have been renamed, re-registered, and are still carrying oil. That's the first point. The second thing, of course, is even more than that. In February, the US sanctioned Sovcomflot and sanctioned Sovcomflot tankers. So that's kind of, I suppose that's a step above the grey. It's not ghost tankers, it's official Sovcomflot. And that, of course, then led to reports of India not accepting the tankers, and the reports of Sovcomflot tankers kind of floating around looking to do. We now know that the Indians are offloading those tankers. They're taking oil from the Sovcomflot tankers, even though they've been sanctioned. And the head of I've forgotten, was it the Indian refinery company? He said that they've had Reliance, exactly. They've had unofficial clearance from the US to go ahead. A meeting between the senior US, which I guess was Secretary of State, and Modi, basically said, go ahead, we don't want the market to be tight. So on that basis, they said, fine, tankers are coming in, even though they're actually sanctioned. But the main point is, actually, was a comment made from a Brussels official at an event I was at a few months ago. He said, by the time we identified the tanker and write to the owner to tell them they're being sanctioned, the tanker has been renamed and the company's been re-registered. So that's the issue there.
So on the second one, I think that's not correct. If export products, first of all, Russia exports crude and exports products, a lot of products actually in the global market. Secondly, we were in a situation where we had, for various reasons, first very high and then very low refinery utilization globally. So that explains partially why refinery in China, but especially in India, were keen to get a lot of crude and then refining themselves. That also explains why the biggest crude exporting region in the world, the Middle East, now all of a sudden exports a lot of products. That's not because they have become a huge refiner, that's because they get Russian products and then re-exports them. There is some wiggle room, but we can see the Russian strategy pretty clearly when there was a shortage of Russian, when a shortfall of Russian product production, and it was resolved by direct intervention of the president by saying we're going to serve the domestic market first, and we scale down the export market. So to keep the population happy is number one. Number two is the export market, and number three is that this is still a market sort of so tight that if there would be a substantial disruption, a lasting disruption of Russian refining capacity, it would be it would be felt and could not be immediately replaced. There's not enough refining spare capacity to replace it immediately globally. So there would be a sizable impact.
So I wanted to comment on the vessel designations because I somewhat disagree here. So I think it's 40 vessels that OFAC has designated. One was actually removed for some reason. So as far as we know, and we track them quite closely, 36 or 37 of those are basically out of the market. Some were allowed to unload, and OFAC gave a license for that, basically saying that we don't want this crude oil to float around on a decrepit 18-year-old non-insured ship. But basically, let me give you an example. There was a tanker that was running from STS operation off the coast of Korea towards India. It was in the middle of the Indian Ocean when it was designated. It was floating around off the coast of Sri Lanka for about a month and a half. It then went to China, received a license from OFAC to unload. It is now unladen and floating around somewhere in the Japan Sea or off of Cosmino. And that is the case for 36 or 37 of those 40. There are a couple that have journeys scheduled, but that doesn't mean they'll ever actually carry them out. And there's, I think, one that is going back and forth between a port in the Sea of Azov and a bigger ship in the Black Sea. The rest is effectively out of the market. The problem is that at the same time that these 40 were designated, Russia has acquired 35 more of them. So you'll have to keep going.
The point being, OFAC with the smart sanctions December can take tankers out of the game. But there are 280 over 300 tankers now. Why don't they just sanction them all?
Because
They don't want to lose
they don't want to lose the capacity.
This doesn't get you anywhere. Yeah. These kind of sanctions as we have will not work. I was saying they don't designate them all because they don't want to disrupt all global oil supplies to that extent, because they don't want to live with high oil prices, full stop. And this is why this discussion is sort of going in nowhere, because if you're not seriously about being willing to consume less oil but at much higher prices, you will not see effective oil or gas sanctions, for that matter, toward Russia. Gas is the specific. Because we are not willing to take the pain, yes, and because we are the G7, and not India and China and others who sort of gleefully exploit the gaps which we have here. Just to repeat, the last point was that I think this is a bit the wrong discussion, because the truth of the matter is that we, the G7, the West, are not willing to incur oil supply disruptions, less oil supplies, less oil consumption at higher prices. And for that is the deeper reason why OFAC and others don't designate more than X boats at a time. And that is the deeper reason why I think energy sanctions by themselves will not have a desired effect on Russia, because they will never be executed properly, because it's the declared intention of the US or the G7 or so not to disrupt global oil markets. It's a bit different in gas, but that's the key reason for oil here. And I don't see any way around that. So that means that a sensible sanctions policy, if that is a constraint, has to concentrate on other aspects. Trade, long-term technology transfers, incredibly important, and financial sector. And there is not enough done in that direction too, because what we have said here about secondary sanctions is true. Secondary sanctions, which is that you threaten to punish anyone who engages in a sanctions violation, especially banks, Chinese banks, Indian banks, or whatever, can also be employed against all these exports which actually go to Russia, including exports of high technology, including exports of chips, of things which can be used for military production, which comes through China, through Kazakhstan, massively. That's where the focus should be, not on something which we, through the back door, have to admit ourselves we are just not strong enough, not capable enough, not politically determined enough to disrupt the global energy system.
Actually, yeah, so just extending from that, we actually do see kind of that reflected in Russian energy policy. So look, as Christoph said, Russia is still able to import technology, it's able to import goods. We can get all sorts of products in Russian shops that should not be there, but they're coming up through Central Asia, through Dubai, etc. All of these goods are coming into Russia across countries that are all getting paid to turn a blind eye because they're getting cheap energy. These are the countries that are getting a discount on oil and oil products, and increasingly are starting to get cheap gas. Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, clearly a new deal has been done with Turkey, with China, etc. So all of these countries are becoming economically more competitive, or industrially more competitive. Let's say in the chemical side here in Germany, the chemical industry, petrochemical industry in Germany is suffering badly because of high energy prices. But the Indian chemical market is booming. And the Turkish chemical market is starting to boom because they're getting cheaper energy from Russia. And in exchange for that, they're not going to block, they will do superficially, have a look in some containers, but they won't do anything serious to stop those goods transiting to Russia because they want the cheap energy, and the Kremlin is playing that.
No, well, I was going to, let me ask her first off. It's the premise of having oil price cap as opposed to real sanctions of some kind, right? So I could ask you a simple question, how could that change? But I just pointed out, I remember at the beginning, for example, Fatih Birol, he would say repeatedly, we have plenty of reserves, of proven reserves in the world that are non-Russian that can be developed to completely replace all the Russian production, right? Now the question is how you get from here to there without causing a big crisis. If our Ukrainian friends, for example, did start to hit it's interesting, they're not hitting the refineries. I'm sorry, they're not hitting the Primorsk, Ust-Lunga, and Novorossiysk as far as the export of oil. But if they did hit the export of oil and took a couple million barrels off the market, there's 6 million barrels off the market for OPEC Plus. I think something like 3 million alone by, okay, I'm asking them a question, yes. 3 million barrels alone the Saudis have offline. So what does this tell us? Is there a transition that could take place given what the market is right now, where other countries would be willing to put more oil on the market, and then eventually develop other?
So the short answer is no, not in the foreseeable future. I mean, I know these arguments, of course, there is too much oil in the world, obviously, including in the Middle East and in Russia. There's spare capacity, a lot in the Middle East. But as long as as long as the political willingness to live with a period of higher oil prices and less oil consumption is not there in the G7, this cannot be executed. I mean, technically, of course, it could be done. But we have 3.5 million spare capacity in the Middle East. We could lift, as has happened already a little bit, the sanctions on Venezuela and Iran, to deal with less Russian oil, gimmicks like that. But it will not cause a big transformation. Russia is too big in the commodity markets to fail in that sense. That yes, it could be replaced, but only after years, and only, very important, with the collaboration of the Middle Eastern producers who have these resources. That collaboration, I said, who is the biggest winner of all of this is the Middle East. That collaboration will not be forthcoming immediately. They will keep the oil price higher. And again, all of this, it's a bit pathetic for us, for the G7, because it takes place not in a high oil price environment, in a comparatively low oil price, below the long-term average, and still we are not able, and I don't see this changing before the elections in the US.
But just a particular riff on that question, what's the nature of the agreement being negotiated between the Americans and the Saudis, which is supposed to include things like oil market as well as relations with China? Is there any aspect of this?
There's not a short-term aspect on Russia, I don't think. But there is, of course, the exchange of the military umbrella, maintenance of the military umbrella for Saudi Arabia, together with an integration of Saudi Arabia in the global economy. That means security guarantees as Saudi Arabia engages in détente with Iran and with Israel. So that is the real situation, to try to put peace to the Middle East by having security treaties between those three main players there with the backing of the US. That got derailed by the Russian invasion of the Ukraine. It's not the reason. The Russian invasion in the Ukraine was not the reason for these agreements. It's the opposite. The Saudis and also the Biden administration, I think, didn't like the fact that Russia did what it did because it derailed this kind of sensible approach.
Well, maybe we do this for just a minute between us. You wanted to ask something of fellow panelists? Or, and then we got to get to these people.
Yeah, I wanted to make a point about what was said about the prospect of energy sanctions or the purpose of energy sanctions. So being cognizant of the issues that exist with their enforcement and also being cognizant of the demonstrated unwillingness in the West, so to speak, to accept higher oil prices, and I completely agree with that, I fail to see a Russia sanctions regime that will bring this war to a quicker end that works without energy sanctions. I just cannot envision that. You will not undermine Russian macroeconomic stability, Russian budget financing without energy sanctions. So ultimately, we'll have to figure this out. The problem is we're reaching a point, so mid last year, US Treasury was still patting itself on the back over the wonderful functioning of the oil price cap. And that really annoyed me because they were selling correlation as causation. And then it kind of blew up in their faces a little bit. We have reached now a point where we know, and it's broadly accepted out there as like the narrative in the media and also from some politicians, that the oil price cap is massively violated and that the shadow fleet is essentially eliminating its leverage altogether. My pitch to governments has been for the last year or so, well, we know you don't want to do anything but the price cap, so make it work. They haven't, so there may be some pressure to do something more drastic. What that more drastic will look like is a different question, but we'll have to answer the question how serious we are about really reducing Russia's ability to continue this war. And if we are, then we have to do something in the energy sphere.
You want to make a point?
One quick point.
Go ahead.
Sorry, just one last, again, just for the purpose of context, just to remind everybody that obviously it's never a good time for a war, but in the sense of the background to this particular war, this whole discussion about hydrocarbons, of course, is the fact that the world before the war was moving so fast towards renewable energy. And every day we see new protests about just stop oil and take oil out of investments from banks, etc. So, to answer your question, Ben, there's plenty of oil in the world, but there's nobody either able to commit to investing to bring that on stream. And I wouldn't think there are too many who would even want to do it because, as I mentioned about the Saudis, they think that there's like 10 or a dozen years of pricing power left, and then renewable energy will have completely destroyed the market. So who's going to spend a couple of $1 billion on a new oil field, other than some short to medium term, but not for the level that's required, because the world has moved towards renewable energy and has decided that the age of hydrocarbon is coming to an end anyway, and Russia's taking advantage of that, is able to take advantage.
I would love to say something about that, but I'm the moderator, so I'll give it to Chris. He wants to say something. Okay.
Yeah, I think I'm more pessimistic than you on this one. I think there's something to be learned in everything, even in an ugly war. And there is something in which this war has crystallized some lessons which we would have to learn anyway, but we learned them probably faster now for us in Europe, or for those who are actually in favor of moving away from fossil fuels and pushing for the energy transition. And I think there's three main points which one should really think about and bear in mind, and they bring home a message which is not nice but necessary to understand. The first of these three main points has to do with the question of energy security versus the energy transition. For the longest time, when you think back, before 22, all the discussions we had on energy markets, especially in countries like Germany, but generally in Europe and to some extent in the US, they were about the energy transition, about replacing fossil fuels and all of that. What the war has brought home in the winter then of 22, 23 was the fear that energy security could be violated. And all of a sudden, everything was about how do we get enough natural gas. You remember it, how much gas, coal, how do we get oil. The very fuels which were meant to be eradicated by the energy system. All of a sudden, the problem was how to get there. And I think the lesson here is that there's a fundamental superiority of fossil fuels over any alternative if one doesn't look at emissions. It's true, because you can transport them. Try transporting the wind and the sun across a border. You can store them, and that gives you a possibility to control them, which is just not there with renewables because of the intermittency problem. If you have transported oil, gas, or coal and stored it somewhere, you can switch it on and off at will. You cannot do with current technology the same with almost all the renewables, especially those in power generation. And what people had sort of taken home there, I think, is this sort of tagline where you say there cannot be an energy transition without energy security. Because if energy security, everybody runs for the economics. Nobody cares about the environment anymore. We know that. We have to face it. And there cannot be energy security without fossil fuels at the moment and at current technologies. That's the first point, which we would have had to learn somehow at some point anyway, but we have crystallized it, accelerated that lesson because of this war. The second point goes a step further, which is we also had the wrong narrative since the 90s. A basic narrative, I keep it very simple and brief, was always this is a matter of substitution. So we have a problem with the climate, problem comes from emissions, most emissions comes from the energy sector. Therefore, what we need to do is to kick out these dirty fuels, the fossil fuels, and replace them with clean fuels. That's the program. Everything else is just a matter of political will, paying enough money, and so on. We have long suspected, and by now I think research has shown it, that this is just not true because sometimes you cannot substitute, especially not in fast-growing economies. You have to, this narrative implies that as you substitute clean for fossil fuels, but the fossil fuels cannot grow. But if there's technical limitations on the speed with which you can replace them, then you either have to lower your growth rate in India and China somewhere, or you have to allow for fossil fuels to grow in lockstep to provide the backup generation which we need for power created by the sun and by wind. So you have a country with 10 units of power, it wants to expand it by 2 units of power. You say, okay, now we just bring in wind and power, but you need, say, 50% backup generation for these cases when there's no wind and no sun. Where do you get them from? You can get them without expanding fossil fuels of that country, only from the legacy institutions which are in place, the legacy fossil capacity. So you take out 2 of the fossil units producing fossil power. Now you need 50% backup for that, and so on. And you can show analytically, beyond a doubt, that this can be done in countries which grow very slowly, which have a very thick network of fossil fuels which you can use in order to provide this backup. But you can equally easily show that even the addition probably of a very dirty coal-fired power station in a country which has not much fossil capacity can increase the share of wind because it provides backup for it. And as long as that's the case, this question of energy security goes on a higher level. And what I think this war has also shown is that these technical limitations will not go away quickly, and therefore you have India and China and others now being much more open about the need to expand coal or nuclear or whatever else there is to provide backup generation. So the wrong narrative that is not substitution. It's about intelligent combination of the different energy carriers we have, the fossil ones and the non-fossil ones. It's complementarities which matter here, which we need to maximize. It's not the limitation even of emissions, it's the limitation of everything we have up in the atmosphere. So it's complementarities again, plus other mechanisms to create more trees and what have you, to limit that. That's the second lesson. And I think the third one is not coming from energy so much, but affects energy. It's an economics lesson. Starting with the pandemic, we are living increasingly, especially in the G7, in the US and in Europe, in a world of big government again, big spending. And not just bad government spending a lot of money, but the population actually asking for it. Pandemic, throw money at it. A war, throw money at it. Energy transition, throw money at it. And as a result, in the last few years, deficits have increased everywhere. Debt has gone almost beyond control. If the US wouldn't sit on the reserve currency, they would have a problem dealing with their debt ratios. And this is going to be with us for a while, because this is now the common sort of, like in the 70s, political attitude, I think, that everybody wants to spend more, everybody subsidizes something, together with the ugly twin brother of this high subsidization, deglobalization, every country for himself, which we already observe. That will come back to haunt us, and that will come back to also affect the energy transition and this very switch from fossil to clean energies. And that is why when I'm in the Middle East, I don't hear the Saudis saying, no, we have a short window. I hear them saying, don't you worry, and being actually quite cocky about it. You will need our oil for quite a long time. And the Russians are saying and know the same thing. And unfortunately, it's a very unpleasant truth, but it has been brought closer to those guys as well by the war.
Well, then we go to...
No. Go ahead.
First to the audience. Okay. So, the whole idea was to enlighten and challenge the public. So we'd like to turn to you for questions. Your name and maybe your affiliation, if you want.
Sure. Rachel Ziamba, Center for New American Security and other places. My question was about gas, which largely has not been subject to the sanctions on oil. Now, part of that is probably is a logic around the lower fiscal impact. The focus for gas, if anything, has been about new projects, right? Especially these ones like Arctic LNG 2 and like. So I'm just interested in any thoughts. I mean, maybe the EU is getting to a point of tackling gas a little bit more. I'm not certain that the votes are going to be there, but just any thoughts about what you're sort of expecting, or and in that way, on either on the European side or on the side of, we hear a lot about how Gazprom in particular has had the revenue declines. They've really, in my view, lost out to, Novatek and the projects, the LNG story. So just any thoughts on gas. And then afterwards, I guess, I have some thoughts about OFAC and some of the things with Sovcomflot. The key is that only 14 of them were sanctioned, and the rest of them, they were all waived until such a time as they actually violated. So again, it just goes back to this argument of the U.S. and G7 is not ready to do without Russian oil. So, but
the first part of your question
is about natural gas.
is the future trajectory of natural gas in Europe.
Well, not so much just Europe, but globally, and whether the sort of changes in natural gas, whether that will have an impact on the Russian budget, on the Russian dynamics.
Yes, please.
Okay, so what's happening on gas? Obviously, what we know, of course, is the Nord Stream pipelines were blown up. They had been cut off before that anyway. They were empty. So pre-war, Russia was selling about 140 billion cubic meters, 140 BCM to Europe. And via pipelines, now that's down to about 25, I guess. BCM, most of that coming, it's either coming still across Ukraine to Slovakia and Czechia, and then others coming up through the Turk Stream pipeline, again, Black Sea, Turkey, and the Turk Stream pipeline through the Balkans. At the end of this year, the contract between Ukraine and Gazprom, or Naftgaz and Gaz, will end, and it will not be renewed. But Ukraine has said that it will still accommodate gas transits on behalf of customers. So in other words, if Slovakia does a deal with Gazprom and it buys gas, then it can book the space in the pipeline. It won't be automatic, but effectively that gas will probably still come. But you're down to about 25 BCM, whereas before it was 140. So Europe has therefore had to find other sources, has been forced to diversify, been talking about it for a long time, but again, a little bit about Russia. When they've no choice, they did it. And of course, US LNG, in particular, Qatari LNG, has come into Europe. substantially taking that market. And of course, it's not, no matter what happens tomorrow, that's not going to leave. That market is not going to go back to the way it was before. So what Russia's doing is two things. One is, of course, LNG, which again was the investment in LNG was partly the response to the start of sanctions in 2014. So they started diversifying. The original project is Yamal and Sakhalin, and the new project is what they call Arctic LNG 2. Now, Arctic LNG 2 has been hit by US sanctions, which blocks the provision of technology going into developing LNG 2, and also the next project, which was supposed to be even bigger, the Murmansk LNG. So what it basically means is that that Russia had last year Russia produced 33 million tons of LNG. It was planning to get that up to 100 million tons by the end of the decade. Quite likely it'll get up to about 40 million tons at the end of this year because one of the LNG streams will come. But it's unlikely it'll ever get much above 45 million tons. Half what they were planning because of sanctions. And as you say, Rachel, the EU is talking about replicating what the US has done. They'll likely come with some tougher sanctions on hitting technology and possibly reducing the flow of LNG into Europe, which means Russia will have to sell it elsewhere at a lower price. And again, so you're hitting the revenue. So on the gas side, yeah, Russia has been hit badly. The response from Moscow, as I mentioned, is just now to start using that gas as almost a form of trade and political barter. So they're now selling gas, planning to sell gas to Uzbekistan using the old Soviet gas network. So selling, I think, about 12 BCM to Uzbekistan that didn't buy any before because they've got a chronic shortage. They'll get a good price. It means that Uzbekistan will stay friendly with Russia. The Kazakhs are also short of gas. They're going to buy gas from Russia to make sure they don't have an energy crisis. Again, they owe Moscow because they're going to get it cheap. And we understand that the discussions between the Russian officials and Chinese in Beijing last week was not about Power of Siberia 2, which is kind of grabs the headlines, but it's like, forget it. It was about using the Kazakh network, upgrading it, which is a lot cheaper than Power of Siberia 2, would be under the control of the Kazakhs, therefore presumably a bit more cost efficient. But the target is, and apparently it is achievable, to get an additional 35 BCM of Russian gas into China. So Russia is now starting to address what to do with all this gas, whereas the focus had been on oil, the shadow tankers, the cutting prices. Now they're starting to look at gas. And of course, but they're having to cut it, sell at a big price. The price of gas to China is 2/3 of the price of gas in Europe. The price of gas to Uzbekistan is probably 50%. So they're taking a huge hit, but they're giving competitiveness advantage to those countries, and those countries therefore owe them. And they're willing to do that. It's a political trade-off. So for Russia is no longer running its energy business on a commercial footing. It is running it on a political footing and for cash flow. So that's on gas, that's what's going on. The one to watch, actually, sorry, and we won't talk about it now because we'll be here all day, but just to highlight it, is the Russians are determined to get gas to India, however long it takes, whatever way they're doing it. And this is what the whole discussion with the Iranians recently about a gas hub just off the South Pars field, the idea being that that would be a staging point to eventually get gas down to maybe an LNG plant in Oman or pipeline to India. So that's Putin's target, is to replace Europe with India, but it's a long way down the road yet.
If there's a question on the gas issue before we move on, because there's so many issues here, somebody want to ask anything further on that? I will later if there's, but yes, you had your hand up. We have the other mic? Yeah, thanks.
My name is Marcus Welch. I'm a journalist and focusing on the impact of Russian war in Ukraine, and I digged a lot in the numbers of Kiev School of Economics.
Thank you, sir. Very good.
have two questions. One is, as far as I understand, we're mostly focusing on crude oil, but 40% of the shipped oil is actually products. And I just want to understand if that would be an option to use the sanction more effective, because how much would that affect the markets of those countries they want to win elections? Yeah. So would that be a better option to do that? Because also the replacement of these ships are much more complicated than the crude oil. Second question is, how do you see or interpret the impact of the huge attacks from Ukraine, new modern drones on the oil industry? What especially in the last weeks, were tremendously rising. And if you look a little bit to the new technology, what Ukraine comes up on this drone business, they can reach targets until 3,000 kilometers, and they did quite well the last weeks. How much does this influence the development of oil revenue in Russia?
On the products front, I mean, there's twin sanctions in December 5, 2022, which hit crude exports, but then on February 5th, the oil products were included. So they have been sanctioned, and they should be affected in the same way. The problem, I think, as Christoph said, was that the cap on the products is so high, like $100, that the prices haven't got to the cap. So they're effectively on sanctions. Sorry, and on the drones, yeah, we were digging into this recently. Because of the Cold War, the refineries are all built with air protection. They have air defense, and the drones are not powerful enough to do a lot of damage. They cause fires, they cause damage that takes a couple of weeks to repair, but all of them, or most of them, have been repaired very quickly, which is one of the reasons why the Ukrainians have recently been asking to be allowed to use US missiles to strike targets in Russia, because then they could destroy refineries. All they can do at the moment is damage them. The production is down by 14%. The Russians have already gone to the Belarusians and have ordered, I think it was 100,000 barrels of product to shore up supplies, and the same, the Kazakhs have been asked to do 100,000 barrels of product to shore up supplies. So at the moment it's like, you know, a bee sting, but it's not that bad. Please, Christoph.
On the product side, there's also a design flaw, which is a technical problem, not a political problem, which is when you have a ship with crude oil and you go there and you do chemical testing, you can very well determine where it's from, precisely which field and which area and so on. When you have a ship full of gasoline or diesel or naphtha, you cannot. And so the question arose early on in the discussion of European sanctions. What do you do in order to trace these products, because they could be refined in India, they could be refined in Russia, and who knows where it really comes from, and how do you prove it's actually Russian crude when you can't show where it's from in the form of products? And that problem was avoided by saying, okay, products are not sanctions, they can be refined anywhere. As soon as the Russian crude is being refined somewhere outside the country, it counts as non-Russian products. And that is what I said earlier, the reason why all of a sudden the Middle East, you know, a huge crude oil exporter, not knowing for being a huge product exporter, suddenly becomes a huge product exporter, because a Russian crude goes there and is refined there and shipped away. And the same in India and so on. So again, the problem is because you can't really measure it, one decided to say, crude which is Russian crude which is refined outside Russia counts as non-Russian products, and therefore one doesn't really have a handle on enforcing these sanctions massively.
Yeah, the foreign minister of the EU, Mr. Borrell, when he heard about this fact that it was being that diesel from oil made from oil from Russia was being re-imported, got quite upset. Said, we have to sanction this. We have to do something. But I think somebody maybe he talked to you, I don't know. But about 2 or 3 weeks later, he didn't talk about it again because you can't determine it. Did you want to say something about the drone strikes and the effectiveness?
Not about the drone strikes, but I mean, you make a good point there. This story about this refining loophole is rather disingenuous. I understand why NGOs, other organizations in civil society are pointing this out, because it basically means we're kind of laundering Russian crude oil into products that then we're buying. But it's disingenuous because it's absolutely built into the system. Not only do we want the Russian crude oil to be on the market, but if we're no longer buying diesel from Russia, it has to come from somewhere. It has to be made from some oil, and so it's Russian oil, and it's made in India. The idea behind the approach is basically to say, like, okay, we're moving the value added of the refining process from Russia to somewhere else, which works in theory, but not really if you're talking, for instance, about... Well, yes, but also if you're talking about an Indian refinery that is 49% owned by Rosneft, then the system doesn't work like that anymore. One thing I wanted to add, like this idea of obfuscating the origin of cargo, mixing oil and whatever, this was kind of what people were thinking when the oil price cap was originally conceived as like what Russia would do. Russia hasn't really had to do it because it can just lie about the price or use the shadow fleet. But we have seen some cases, there was some media reporting when it comes to oil products because, as you said, they're basically impossible to clearly identify, where shipments of oil products came to a Turkish port where there's really no other facility in sight, and then later these oil products go somewhere and are declared as Turkish oil products. In some cases, this was a really bad message because it went to a US military base and ended up being fuel for US military aircraft. So this story caught some attention, but there are some things like that, but not at scale.
Turns out the British Navy had a similar problem. But yes.
I mean, just one quick point. I mean, there's obviously the word hypocrisy. There's an enormous amount of hypocrisy, and there's an enormous amount of I guess what you say, turning a blind eye, I suppose we'd say in English. And I just want to point out two. One is here in Berlin, the refinery outside Berlin, which used to be owned by Rosneft, which was obviously nationalized by the German government, and is now using oil coming from Kazakhstan, and all of that oil is coming through the Russian pipeline system. So in other words, the Russians are quite happy for the Kazakh oil to go to the refinery that they used to own in Berlin. And the same thing with coal. When the embargo on buying Russian coal in Europe was put in place, they switched to buying, 500,000 or 600,000 tons of Kazakh coal, all of which uses the Russian railway system. So again, you think, it's the Ukrainians who are getting squeezed, but everybody else is kind of making deals to get around it. The Russians are making money, and the market's being supplied, and the refinery here is not running out of oil because it's coming through Russia. So,
just one brief. I think it's close to my heart. It's very important to realize that it's us who are the problem. Our unwillingness to live with higher oil prices and less oil gives rise to all these machinations. It's not the clever Russians and it's not the bad Kazakhs. It's really the consumer markets who fail. And one shouldn't pursue sanctions if one doesn't have the willpower to do so, I think.
The Shved refinery is a classic. The Shved refinery, the Kazakh oil going there is a classic because there is no pipeline that runs from Kazakhstan to Germany. It's Russian oil, and it's done a swap, which is basically you've changed the label on the box, and it's just Russian importing oil to Germany to be refined to run in your cars. But that's the problem, as Christoph says, is that we're not prepared to actually man up and say, okay, we will bite the bullet and cut this off. The Russian budget, which I showed you, I mean, it gets into trouble when oil prices fall below $70. At the moment, it's absolutely happy. If we can get oil below $70 or stop buying it, then that would actually scupper the Russian economy. But I don't know how you get there, because as Christoph said, that the Middle East will not let oil fall that low. Please.
Stephen, you have a question? Anybody, let me know so I don't miss you later. Okay. Yes, please.
Okay, my name is Stefan Wilms. I work in African infrastructure. But this is not a question on Africa. You said several times that we in Europe are not willing to pay more for our oil. And well, I would admit I don't like paying more in any case, but could you explain how much more would we have to pay? I mean, because I don't feel well informed by press and politicians. Nobody told me that I would need to pay more or how much more I would need to pay. I haven't really been asked. Yeah. So somebody took that decision for me.
No, I think this is a really good question. That is the key question. And there it becomes a bit more complicated because the question is we only the G7 who are actually imposing these sanctions, or does we include the Indias and Chinas of this world who help then the oil to find a way around? And so if you really wanted to take Russia's exports off the market, which would have to be the aim, the target of sensible sanction system, then we're talking about 12 million barrels, so take them off, products together. That could be a potential price spike. How high, nobody can tell you honestly, but how long it lasts and how high this depends to a large extent on another region, which is the Middle East, which sits on a large degree of spare capacity. And my best guess is that we would talk about prices somewhere north of, but not too much north of 100, and then however long it takes, if the Middle East plays along. And if China and India play along. If they don't play along, then it becomes even easier for us to say we can't do it anyway. And it's true. So I think these energy sanctions, they are, as an economist about economic warfare, they are something not fully thought through. So that's why it's falling on our legs all the time again.
I'll just make a comment. I think that you have a question, right? Yeah, next. Maybe just phrasing it, looking at the same question, just a little bit different. No disagreement at all here. But if you talk to Mr. Biden or Mr. Macron, they might look at it as political risk for who's going to be their successor. And then what happens with the war? There's also this, but you're absolutely right. You have a question?
Yeah, my name is Adrian Garcia-Landa. I'm a freelance journalist. And I have a question for the first Ben. Sorry, I don't know your last name. That's you. You mentioned in your keynote that if we hadn't paid Russia the oil we were buying from them, its economy might have broken down. Do you think this is realistic and this could have been done? Was there the will to it? And then the second question to all of you. If the sanctions don't work because we don't want to cut off Russian oil from the system, is there, apart from the price, another possible impact on the world economy if you cut out Russian oil?
So let me go first. So yes, there was that period when the extreme sanctions came in, and there were two sanctions in particular that shocked everybody that we weren't expecting. One was the ban on SWIFT, using the internet, basically ban on using the dollar. And that had been discussed, but everyone was saying that's off the table, that's too extreme. And the second one was freezing the central bank's currency reserves, $300 billion. That came out of complete left field. Nobody was expecting that at all. The result of what happened in Russia was the ruble immediately collapsed. It went to, I forget what it was, 150 to the dollar. It's normally around 80, 90. And the whole system was shaking. And they came very close to a financial meltdown. Loss of trust in the banking system, loss of trust in the currency. And as I say, the central bank governor, Nabulina, came in very fast with a massive rate hike. They flooded the banking system with cash. They put in capital controls. There was a ban. Nobody in Russia could take out more than $10,000 in dollars at a time. And clamped down, closed the system down. But what kept Russia going at that point was this continuous pipe of Western European cash, dollars, euros, paying for the oil and gas. And as we've said, that the West has been terrified of actually shooting itself in the foot and cutting itself off from Russian energy. And so, ironically, even in the first part of the war, that gas wasn't sanctioned. Oil wasn't sanctioned for a year. It took a long time for everyone to come around to actually hit that one, because everyone was terrified of our own energy security, of the impact on our own economies. And nobody was prepared to do that. And part of that was the thinking that if we cut Russia off from those payments, then they would just cut off the oil and gas. And our economies here would suffer a huge shock as well. And no one was prepared to risk that. So they continued to pay. I said at the time, I thought the compromise was put it into escrow. The Russians have been paid, it's their money, it's just they can't access it. And if you'd done that for the first 3 months of the war, I'm pretty sure you would have had a huge financial crisis in Russia, and then made it extremely difficult to perpetrate the war, which is get us where we wanted to. And in the meantime, we've cut them off from those revenues anyway. So the second question?
I can absolutely say for 100% certainty that if that had happened, Russia would have cut supply immediately.
Yeah.
I mean, escrow would be the same as stealing,
Yes.
as far as they're concerned.
Yeah.
So, and the other thing to bear in mind, of course, it's not just oil and gas. Russia, of course, is an enormous exporter of other products. It's the world's biggest wheat exporter. It doesn't come to Europe, but clearly if it was cut off, would have a huge price in global. But you look at nickel and aluminium and timber and everything else. So we talk about oil and gas because it's the headline number, but you have a crisis in Russia, you have a major disruption in all sorts of areas that we can only guess at. So again, that's not an excuse to say why one should be careful, but it is a fact, and it's obviously part of the thinking in why it didn't happen.
So the second question, and how bad would it get? And so there's something nobody can answer. If ever anyone tells you that a decrease of 2 million barrels of oil production results in a price increase of $13.50, then just walk away, because nobody can say that. What we do know, so we have precedent, what we do know is that we had a period between 2010 and 2012 or 13, the average oil price $111. It didn't bring the economy to its knees at all. What we also know is that the efficiency with which oil is used, so how much oil you need to drive a kilometer or to produce a plastic bag or whatever, is increasing at a very rapid clip and in a very regular, almost linear fashion. When you combine these two things together, then by today's standards, oil prices, like in the last oil price crisis in the 70s, would probably not do too much damage. But then comes the question, how long is it going to last? How high is the spike? And in principle, high oil prices do create two sorts of problems. One is they can create inflation, and the other one is they can increase high costs, and therefore a lack of demand and an increase in unemployment and all of that. You know. I think that if Russia really wanted, they could have triggered in that instance a really severe disruption for unprepared Western countries. There's no high storage and nothing like that, which would have created an economic recession. Now, are you willing to take an economic recession to end a war like that? Probably. Would Russia end the war if it's without money? Probably not. So it's a matter of how far. I still think the intelligent way out of that would be to think of other kind of sanctions, in particular of blocking the technology which Russia uses all over the place, because they do not have the capacity to develop technology, chips, artificial intelligence. They have lost that. They have lost the best people in that field. So that needs to be cut off. But energy, there's too much guesswork in that.
Just quickly to jump in here, so we've been talking about this kind of unwillingness in the West to walk the walk, and in a way I feel like it's gotten worse. So in 2022 and 2023, it feels like governments were looking for sanctions measures that would have costs that are under control for our side and would be effective in terms of hitting Russia. Right now, they really seem to be looking for sanctions that have zero cost, and that just simply doesn't exist. And it may have to do with the US election, and I sympathize with this. From a Ukrainian perspective, or the perspective of someone who works for a Ukrainian institution, let's say we step really hard on Russian oil right now, and in 6 months Donald Trump wins, that really does absolutely nothing for the Ukrainians. So I have some sympathy for that. But we're looking for measures right now that have zero cost. And it's not just the case in the sanctions sphere. It is basically the same hesitancy and fear when it's about military support, when it's about additional financial support to Ukraine. We remember the 6 months in the delay in the US Congress. And it's the same with confiscation of Russian assets. Like, don't touch anything. It will, the world will end if we do X, Y, Z.
So Ralph has the microphone.
Schnelle, formerly German Foreign Office. Given this unwillingness of the G7 to accept the effects of disruption in the energy market, I was wondering, you pointed out that secondary sanctions on the financial side were showing more and more effect. I wonder how long the G7 will continue that path if it has disruptive effect.
So look, Russia has very few vulnerable points. Finance is one of them. Banks is one of them. That they're busily transitioning to the use of the yuan. They've got rid of all of their dollars, all of their euros, all of their pounds. And then the reserves now are 50% yuan and 50% gold. But that makes it very difficult. So the trade with China is the balance. The mutual trade is balanced, so they can settle that in local currencies. But they need dollars for everything else. And all these technology imports, for example, that Russia imported last year, only 2% less technology than it did pre-war. So, and that's all got to be paid for in dollars or euros. They do have access because this period when they were exporting euros to Europe in 2022, all of that money was accumulating at the level of the refineries and the Russian companies, trade companies registered in Europe. There's a slush fund of, I don't know, Bloomberg estimated $80 billion. We think it's closer to $150 billion of money offshore legally in Europe somewhere else. And the trade, the black trade, the shadow trade has also all been doing through shell companies. So a lot of cash is accumulating unseen. And that money is being used to pay for these imports. But that can't go on forever. I mean, the one place you can get them, and OFAC showed when it went after these tankers in December, and immediately they had big problems. And again, it's followed up in February, March, where the biggest Chinese banks, who were Russia's best buddies, pulled out, stopped doing business. Turkish pulled out, stopped doing business. And there's one place you can go after them. And now they're trying to find, what they're doing in China is they're going to smaller banks, Chinese banks that don't have accounts in the West, particularly not the States. And they can't be sanctioned. But this is already introducing procedural problems, delays, is hitting the trade, the Chinese-Russian trade, which is down in the last few months as a result of this. I don't know if you can use that to actually, strangle Russia, but certainly you can it's causing major headaches. But outside that, as I say, the lack of debt, Russia's lack of debt, makes it very hard to sanction. Please.
I think if I understood your question correctly, then you have a great point together with what he has said. If Russia has the capacity to retaliate by a disruption, and if the collective West is not willing to take a disruption, then what's the point discussing any kind of sanctions? And that is a very valid observation, I think. There's this old saying that if you want to have dinner with the devil, you need a very long spoon. And I think it probably makes a difference if one has these kind of sanctions across the board in the financial sector, secondary sanctions against other countries, which do not provide a simple cutoff point where Russia feels, cornered and then has to jump, but which gradually sort of increases the temperature. And I guess that is what most of us have in mind when we say it's not hopeless to deploy sanctions, but you should not sort of do it in a way which is just doomed to fail from the beginning, or one should probably not place too many hopes in it for an immediate effect. It's going to be a long game, and the Russians have realized that before the West did.
Can I just add? No, just one. Talking about Russian jokes and their attitude to sanctions, there's a Russian expression that today is worse than yesterday, but at least it's better than tomorrow. They're going to stick this out, please.
We have a question.
Yasser Aboualik, I'm the Germany correspondent for Al Arabi TV. We're based in Qatar. What a surprise. My question is, we've been hearing a lot about the resilience of what I could call the resilience of the Russians in anticipating the energy sanctions regime and preparing for that through the shadow fleet, through acquiring ships, through at least preparing to acquire ships. And also we've heard about the Western Hemisphere being on a learn by trying process in applying these sanctions. I would like to ask from an Eastern Hemisphere point of view, Christoph, you mentioned that if the West has to man up and impose really hard sanctions, energy sanctions, and take up a price hike north of $100, and that provided that the Middle East plays ball, why would the Middle East play ball with the West if they are the biggest winner along with China and India from discounted Russian oil and also being able to products? And I've also heard mention of a booming petrochemical industry in India. They're all winning from this whole regime play, sanctions play, I'm sorry. So why would they actually play ball with the West?
So I didn't say it was a misunderstanding that the Middle East would have to pay for it. I said they would have to go along with it in the sense of producing oil to replace the missing Russian barrels. And they they would do that, and they would get very high oil prices for them, so they should be happy. But at the end of doing so, they would be back in a world where they would have their prime customer, which used to be the US, being self-sufficient in oil, and where when Russia has lost the war, it will not disappear from the map. It will become a competitor again, selling oil, presumably very cheaply, to recover some of the lost money they have. And it would not be, in the medium term even, necessarily beneficial for the Middle East. They may feel that they're much better off playing Mr. Biden and Mr. Trump by being the thing which picked, whatever you call this, which tips the scale. And that is certainly what we are seeing at the moment. OPEC has made no efforts whatsoever to tilt the balance one way or another. They just always have stepped in there when it was threatening to go one way and prevented that. There's no accident that oil prices have been sort of between $80 and $90 forever now, pretty much since the game became an energy sanction game in earnest. They are the ones who have the spare capacity and can balance the market, and therefore balance the prices. And that's what they're doing. I don't see that incentive to change that.
Unfortunately, we talked all a lot, but a little bit short.
Hello, everyone. My name's Paul Delaguardia. I'm an economist. I used to work with Ben Hilgenstock over at the Institute of International Finance. I started my career in Moscow, spent a few years there. So my question was to Christoph's last point. I came across an idea not too long ago about G7 countries, especially the US, increasing oil production to try to flood the market. And my initial reaction to this was, is that even possible? Would that be a feasible way to put pressure on Russia? And I say this coming from someone who's not an energy expert. I tend to focus more on emerging market debt and a little bit of financial sanctions. So please enlighten me, whether it's Christoph, Chris, or anyone on the panel. Thank you.
So if you were to flood the market, it's true Russia would suffer financially. We have seen their reserves, they wouldn't disappear immediately, but the Middle East would suffer even more. So they're very unlikely to do that. And then in order to do that, somebody else would have to step in and produce a lot more oil if all the Russian oil is supposed to, if the Russians really stop exporting all their oil, which for technical reasons they couldn't even do. So hypothetically, it's probably possible to put pressure on prices, especially if Russian exports are allowed to continue. But those who would do so would shoot themselves in the foot again. And they may have to do so eventually, but for very different reasons. When oil demand falls and OPEC has to find out who produces and who has to disappear from the market. Because what we have, I mean, also by way of background, the oil market has always been rising. Since the beginning of using oil commercially, oil demand has continuously increased literally almost every year. And so in a rising market, when you have a producer cartel, you can sort of cut production, you can play around with capacity. Eventually, you will always regain your market share because the demand keeps up. But in a falling market, when demand falls, the low-cost producer is king. Because what happens in a falling market is suddenly, in order just to keep your exports constant as a producing country, you need to you need to increase your market share. Algebra. Market shrinks. In order to sell the same 10 barrels, you need to increase your market share at the expense of somebody else. How do you do that? You engage in price competition. Right? And so that's going to be a race to the bottom eventually when oil demand starts falling. Some people like me would say it's happening in less than a decade. Other people say it's still very far away. But leave that aside. That's the sort of background. As long as we are not in that world, and they will do whatever they can to prevent oil markets from being flooded.
Maybe that will doesn't have to come from the G7. What if you just totally scrap sanctions on Venezuela or alternative ideas?
Yeah, this is, that's what's happening. No? And that's what's happening. Iran is sanctioned, but then they have been loosened a great deal. But so far, I was wrong. They might do so eventually when they think that their market is really seriously threatened. Remember that in 2020, in March 2020, when COVID started, when the pandemic started, there was a short period where Saudi Arabia threatened to flood the market in order to get the Russians to comply to output cuts. So that scenario is a possibility, but that's for the Middle East as well, and for Russia, for everybody outside the G7, such a disaster scenario that a lot has to come together for that to happen. But we shouldn't wait for it, so let's put it that way.
Well, yeah, Sechin thought he was going to start a price war, right? And do this for 4 or 5 years and kill American shale. It'd be the end of the ability to put sanctions. He learned how the market worked. He was taught by the Saudis in about 3 days, right? I think, or something. Anyway, there was a question here.
Matthias Brückmann, I'm a Berlin-based journalist. I want to focus on the Middle East, especially to the Emirates. We are seeing that Dubai is coming more and more the financial capital of Russia. So we saw the same with Iran. Dubai was a black hole for Iran that time, but then the United States closed that. So my question is, why there is no political effort from the EU and from the US to close Dubai as a financial hub for Russia, because they are producing a lot of black money, which is is threatening our democracy in Europe and the United States. The money is you see where it goes, and so there is really a threat for us, and I do not understand why the US and Europe do not close that black hole.
Sure, actually. Yeah. Okay. Well, look, if I could, and I'll make this quick. Just simply that it's something I spent a lot of time looking at, because when I went to Abu Dhabi before I was Russia, Abu Dhabi, I got there just as the first Gulf War was starting. But more importantly, it was when a bank called BCCI was imploding. And if you remember BCCI, it was, now with a bit of hindsight, the most corrupt bank. But it was also the bank that was used by everybody channeling money in and out of places like Afghanistan, Iran, across the Middle East, Pakistan, you name it, it all went through BCCI. When BCCI was shut down because it just became simply too egregious to survive, we now know from people like Robert Baer and others have written about this, there was a period of about 5 years when the Western security forces were going crazy because they couldn't track where the money was going. They couldn't track all of those activities. And then Dubai emerged, as it were, and Emirates Bank, allegedly, Your Honor. And everybody relaxed again because now there's a structure. And Dubai provides that structure. It was always a pirate port before the Trucial States, before the East India Company. It's always been involved in piracy, and trading is just an extension of that. And actually, just one quick point, again, for the context, reason why Dubai is so important to Russia is also part of that planning that was done from 2014. Russia and India fairly quickly agreed to build what's called the International North-South Transport Corridor, essentially a major rail link from St. Petersburg down to now Bandar Abbas, eventually Chabahar, which is supposed to provide a trading link between India and Europe. But right now, it's just across the Gulf from Dubai. So an enormous amount of goods, like Western cars and other goods that are coming into Moscow, are coming through Dubai across and on that rail track. So it's, again, for all these reasons, Dubai. But as to why they want to shut it down, because it's simply too important. Eventually, yes, it's less important than it was, for example, during the height of the Afghan war. But who can say what's going to happen in Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iran tomorrow? If you drive north of Dubai, well, east of Dubai, and you go up towards Ras Al Khaimah, there are bare mountains, but you feel as if you're driving to the Alps because of the white tops on the mountains. And when you get closer, you see it's not snow, it's all listening devices, it's all the white domes. It's all on every single raised piece of hill pointing into the east. And therefore, it is too important. And the bottom line is they therefore get away with a lot.
One question I didn't ask, and I won't, but I just raised, is that we talked about the effect or ineffectiveness of sanctions on Russia, but the effect of the energy war, differential effect on different countries in Europe seems to be an important issue. What's the effect on Germany and so forth? Anyway, no time. I want to thank everybody on behalf of the Berlin Energy Forum for coming. We hope to do this on some regular, it'd be great to do it 10 times a year. I would like to thank BNE IntelliNews in particular, our sponsor of our initial, my partner Ben in this endeavor, has sponsored this. Thank you very much. But this means that, the way to do something like this viably and to get such interesting persons who don't live down the street, unfortunately, to get them here and so forth, and take care of everything, is sponsors. And so we're happy to come by your business or institution or wherever you are. If you're interested in this and would like to see it grow, we'll come and give you a pitch and see if you might want to sponsor the forum in the future and to be able to sustain it. So,
yeah, I would just like to say thanks to everyone for coming and showing such interest, especially to our guests and to our partner at Kiev School of Economics who've made this all happen. I also invite you to look at our publications, BNE IntelliNews and Newspace.